The scream that tore from Hazel Leland's throat on that cold October morning in 1878 sent every crow for a mile scattering into the pale Wyoming sky. For she had found her father face down in the dirt of their own barn, a bullet hole in his back and his hand still curled around a pitchfork he never got the chance to use. Jacob Leland had been a quiet man, a homesteader who had carved 40 acres of hay meadow and cattle range out of the high plains near the town of Larkspur Crossing, and he had never harmed a soul that Hazel knew of. She was 20 years old that autumn, unmarried, with her mother long since buried from a fever 3 winters past, and now she knelt in the straw and blood of the only family she had left, and she did not weep so much as she went hollow, the way a well goes hollow when the water table drops and there is nothing left to draw from. The sheriff of Larkspur Crossing, a heavy-set man named Otis Bramwell who had more experience settling arguments over cattle brands than solving murders, rode out with 2 deputies and looked at the body and looked at the tracks leading away from the barn toward the eastern ridge, and he shook his head slowly. "Could be drifters," he said. "Could be somebody wanted his water rights. Your daddy's spring feeds half the valley, Miss Leland, and there's men in this territory who'd kill for less than a spring that never runs dry." Hazel did not answer him. She stood in the yard with her arms wrapped around herself, staring at the ridge where the tracks vanished into rock and sage, and she made herself a promise right there, with the blood still fresh in the barn behind her, that she would not be an easy woman to kill. The funeral was small, as funerals in that country tended to be, held on a windswept hill behind the little clapboard church where her mother already lay. The preacher spoke of God's plan, and Hazel found she could not listen to a word of it, for she did not believe there was any plan in a bullet fired into an old man's back while he fed his horses. Neighbors came. The widow Hutchins brought a ham. The Calloway boys dug the grave. And through it all Hazel stood dry-eyed and rigid, because she had already decided that grief was a luxury she could not afford, not with the ranch to run and killers still walking free somewhere on that eastern ridge. In the weeks that followed, Hazel discovered just how alone a young woman could be on a homestead in Wyoming territory. The cattle still needed moving, the fences still needed mending, and the well pump still froze some mornings and needed a hard strike with a hammer to loosen it. She managed, because she had helped her father with all of it since she was a girl of 10, but she managed with her heart in her throat every time a rider appeared on the horizon, and she managed with an old shotgun that she was not entirely certain she could fire straight if her life depended on it, which she had begun to suspect it might. It was Otis Bramwell, of all people, who first mentioned the name Albert Townsend to her, one afternoon in late October when she rode into Larkspur Crossing for flour and coffee and found the sheriff leaning against the porch rail of the general store. "There's a fellow come to town," Bramwell said, chewing on a matchstick. "Took a room above the livery. Says he used to ride for a cattle outfit down in Colorado territory, and before that he wore a badge in Kansas. Quiet sort. Keeps to himself. But I seen him put 5 holes in a playing card at 30 paces behind the jail, and I never seen shooting like that in all my years. Why should I care about a stranger's marksmanship, Sheriff?" Bramwell shifted his weight and looked at her with something like pity, which she hated more than almost anything else she had endured that autumn. Because a woman alone on 40 acres with a killer still loose is a woman who ought to know which end of a pistol the bullet comes out of, Miss Leland. I'm just saying, man's got to eat. He might take on some teaching work for a little money and his supper. Hazel had scoffed at the notion for 3 full days before her own fear got the better of her pride, and on the 4th day she rode into town, tied her mare outside the livery, and climbed the narrow stairs to knock on the door of a man she had never met. Albert Townsend opened the door with a caution that told her he was a man used to trouble finding him, and for a moment neither of them spoke, for Hazel found herself looking into a pair of gray eyes set in a face weathered by sun and wind and something else besides, something that looked almost like sorrow worn so long it had become just another feature, like the scar that ran along his jaw. He was perhaps 30 years old, tall, lean in the way of men who worked hard for their bread, and he wore his dark hair a little too long beneath his hat, as though he had not thought to visit a barber in some time. "Miss Leland," he said, and she startled that he knew her name. "You've heard of me." "Everybody in Larkspur Crossing has heard of you," he said quietly. "I am sorry about your father." Something in the way he said it, low and careful, made her study him a moment longer than politeness required, but she pushed the strange feeling aside and got to the business that had brought her. "Sheriff Bramwell tells me you can shoot." "I can. I want you to teach me." Albert Townsend was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes moving over her face as though he were reading something written there that she herself could not see. "Why?" "Because the man who killed my father is still out there, and I do not intend to wait for him to come finish the job." He nodded slowly, and something passed behind his eyes, gone before she could name it. "I will teach you," he said, "but I will teach you right, which means you will not enjoy it, and it will take longer than you want it to. Meet me at first light behind the old Hutchins barn, the one that burned last spring. There is space enough there and no one to complain about the noise." She agreed, and rode home with her heart beating strangely fast, though she told herself it was only the cold. The first lesson was nothing like Hazel had imagined. She had thought perhaps he would hand her a pistol and let her fire it, but instead Albert Townsend spent the better part of 2 hours simply teaching her to hold an unloaded Colt single-action army, to understand its weight, to learn how the cylinder turned and the hammer fell, to dry fire it 100 times until her arm ached and her patience frayed thin. "You are angry," he observed, watching her jaw clench as she lowered the pistol for perhaps the 50th time. "I came here to learn to protect myself, not to hold an empty gun like a child playing at soldiers." "An empty gun is how you learn not to flinch," Albert said, and there was no scorn in his voice, only a patience that surprised her. "A woman who flinches at the hammer falling will flinch worse when there is a man standing in front of her meaning her harm, and a flinch at the wrong moment will get you killed faster than no gun at all. You want to protect yourself, Miss Leland. Then you will do exactly as I say, and you will not enjoy it, same as I told you." She had wanted to argue, but there was something in his steady certainty that quieted her. And by the end of that first week, she found herself dry-firing the Colt with a smoothness that surprised even her. And by the end of the second week, he finally allowed her live rounds, and the first time she fired at the tin cans lined along the burned fence rail, the recoil nearly knocked her off her feet, and the noise left her ears ringing for an hour. But she hit nothing at all, and she was furious about it. "Good," Albert said. "Good, I missed every single can. You did not run, you did not drop the gun, you held your ground even though the noise frightened you. That is worth more than hitting a can, Miss Leland, I promise you that." Over the following weeks, through the last gasp of autumn and into the bone-cold beginning of a Wyoming winter, Hazel rode to the burned Hutchins barn 3 mornings a week, and Albert Townsend taught her to shoot the way a good teacher teaches anything worth knowing, patiently, without cruelty, correcting her stance with a light touch on her elbow or her shoulder that she found herself thinking about long after she had ridden home. She began to hit the cans, then to hit them consistently, then to draw the pistol from the holster he had given her and fire in one motion the way he showed her. And with each small victory, she saw something warm flicker in those gray eyes of his, something that looked almost like pride. They talked, too, in the quiet moments between lessons, while her fingers were sore from cleaning the pistol the way he insisted she learn, or while they sat on the frozen ground and shared the coffee she had taken to bringing in a tin pot. She learned that Albert had grown up in Missouri, that he had lost his own mother young, that he had ridden with a Kansas town marshal for 3 years before drifting west, chasing work that never quite settled him. He learned that Hazel had taught herself to read from her mother's Bible and a handful of borrowed novels, that she dreamed sometimes of seeing a city larger than Larkspur Crossing before she died, that she missed her father so fiercely some mornings she could not make herself rise from bed until the cattle's lowing forced her to. "He would be glad you are learning this," Albert told her once in November when the first hard frost had silvered the grass and their breath came in white clouds between them. "Your father, I mean, a man who loved his daughter would want her able to defend herself. You did not know him." Albert's gaze dropped to the pistol in his hands, and for just a moment something tightened in his face, something Hazel would later remember and understand far too late. "No," he said softly. "I did not know him." By December, Hazel could not deny to herself any longer that what she felt for Albert Townsend went well beyond gratitude for his teaching. She found herself dressing with more care on the mornings she rode to their lessons, found herself laughing more easily at his dry, quiet humor, found herself watching the way his hands moved, sure and gentle, whether he was correcting her grip on the colt or helping her mare over a patch of ice. And she saw, too, in the way his eyes softened when she arrived, in the way he sometimes seemed to forget himself and reach as though to tuck a loose strand of her chestnut hair beneath her hat, before catching himself and pulling his hand back, that he felt something of the same. It was at the Larkspur Crossing Christmas social, held in the schoolhouse with its windows fogged from the press of bodies and the two big stoves burning cedar logs, that Albert finally asked her to dance, standing awkward and formal in a clean shirt that still bore the creases of having been folded too long in a saddlebag. "I am not much of a dancer," he admitted, as the fiddle player struck up a slow waltz. "Neither am I," Hazel said, though it was not entirely true, and when his hand settled at her waist and hers rested on his shoulder, she felt something settle in her chest that had not felt settled since the morning she found her father in the barn. They danced twice more that night, and when Albert walked her out to her wagon beneath a sky thick with stars, he took her gloved hand in both of his and held it a moment longer than necessary. "Miss Leland, Hazel," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, "I want you to know that these months teaching you have been the finest thing to happen to me in a long while. I did not expect that, coming to this town." "Nor did I," Hazel admitted, and when he leaned down and pressed a soft, careful kiss to her cheek, she found herself wishing, fiercely and without shame, that he had aimed for her lips instead. It was only 3 days later that the trouble which had been building quietly beneath the surface of Larkspur Crossing finally broke into the open, when a man named Silas Corwin rode into town with 4 hired hands at his back and posted a notice on the door of the general store announcing that he intended to purchase every parcel of land bordering Leland Creek, and that any holdout who refused a fair offer would find the coming winter considerably harder than they expected. Silas Corwin owned the largest cattle operation in 3 counties, a sprawling ranch called the Double C that had grown, year by year, by swallowing the smaller homesteads around it, and everyone in Larkspur Crossing understood, though few said it aloud, that Corwin's method of persuasion was not always limited to fair offers and patient negotiation. Hazel had heard her father speak of him with quiet contempt more than once, had heard him say that Corwin wanted the water rights on Leland land more than he wanted almost anything else in the territory, for the spring that fed her family's 40 acres was the surest water source for 10 miles in any direction, and a man who controlled it could starve out half the small ranchers in the valley simply by choosing when to let the creek run low. Hazel had not thought much of Corwin's ambitions in the fog of her grief, but standing in the general store reading that notice with her jaw set, she felt something cold settle into her stomach, a suspicion she had not allowed herself to speak even in her own mind. Her father had refused to sell to Corwin twice, she remembered now, had come home angry from town both times, muttering about a man who thought money could buy anything a body owned. And her father had died with a bullet in his back not 2 months after the second refusal. She rode straight to the sheriff's office, her hands shaking on the reins, and demanded to know why Silas Corwin had never once been questioned about her father's murder. "There was no evidence, Miss Leland," Bramwell said, not meeting her eyes. "Corwin's a powerful man in this territory. I cannot go accusing him without proof, and there was none to find. The tracks led east and vanished on rock. "Convenient," Hazel said bitterly, and she left the sheriff's office more frightened and more determined than she had been in weeks. That evening, riding home in the fading light, she found Albert waiting for her at the fork where the road split toward her homestead, sitting his horse with an unusual stillness that made her slow her mare. "You heard about Corwin's notice," she said. "I did." Albert's face, always guarded, seemed tonight to carry something heavier still, some private weight she could not read. "Hazel, I want you to be careful. A man like Corwin does not make idle threats. You speak as though you know him." There was a pause, brief but unmistakable, before Albert answered. "I have heard of him. His reputation carries far in this territory." She let it pass, though something in his hesitation snagged at the edge of her mind like a burr caught in wool fibers, small and irritating and impossible to entirely dismiss. And she rode the rest of the way home turning it over, telling herself it was nothing, that grief and fear were making her suspicious of shadows. 2 days later, Hazel rode into town to purchase ammunition at the general store, and it was there, digging through a crate of old newspapers the storekeeper kept for wrapping goods, that her hand closed around a torn page from a Colorado newspaper dated some 3 years back, and her eye caught on a name printed in the small type of a story about a range war near Trinidad. The story described a violent dispute between two cattle outfits, and named among the hired guns involved in the fighting a man called Albert Townsend, described as having once ridden for the very outfit that later became, after a series of consolidations and land purchases, the foundation of Silas Corwin's fortune. Hazel stood very still in the dim store, the paper trembling faintly in her fingers, and told herself there must be some mistake, some other Albert Townsend, for the territory was full of drifters and the name could not be so uncommon. But that night she could not sleep, and the next morning before their lesson she found herself asking him directly, watching his face as she did. "Did you ever ride for Silas Corwin, Albert, or for any outfit that became his?" The color drained slowly from his face, and in that moment, watching him fail to answer quickly enough, watching the guilt bloom openly across features he had always kept so carefully composed, Hazel understood with a terrible, sinking certainty that she had found something true and something that would break her. "Hazel," he said, and his voice had gone rough, "let me explain before you think the worst. Answer the question." "Yes," he said quietly. "I rode for Corwin 3 years before I quit and came north. And were you riding for him this past October?" The silence stretched long enough that she had her answer before he spoke a single word, and when he finally did speak, his voice broke in a way she had never heard from him before, not once in all their weeks together. "I was there," he said. "The night your father died. I was there, Hazel, but I swear before God I did not fire the shot that killed him." Hazel felt the ground tilt beneath her, felt the careful, warm thing that had been growing in her chest for 2 months curdle into something sharp and cold, and she stepped back from him as though he had struck her. "You have been teaching me to shoot," she said, her voice shaking, "with the very hands that helped kill my father, and you let me believe, you let me fall in." She could not finish the sentence, could not give voice to the word love when it had become, in an instant, the cruelest thing she had ever almost said. "Let me tell you what happened," Albert said, reaching for her, and she jerked away as though his touch might burn her. "Do not touch me. Do not come near me again, Albert Townsend, or whatever your real name is. I trusted you. I let you into the one part of my life I thought was safe, and you were there the night my father died and you said nothing. For 2 months you said nothing." "Because I was afraid," Albert said, and there were tears standing openly in his eyes now, something she had never once seen from him. "I was afraid that if you knew, you would never let me near enough to protect you, and I could not bear the thought of you facing Corwin's men alone. I have been trying to make it right, Hazel, in the only way I knew how. By lying to me, by courting me while my father's blood was still fresh on your conscience." He had no answer for that, none that would satisfy the wound tearing open in her chest, and Hazel turned her mare and rode away from the burned Hutchins barn without looking back, leaving Albert Townsend standing alone in the frozen grass with his hat in his hands and his confession unfinished. She did not sleep that night, nor the night after. She sat by her father's grave in the cold until her hands went numb, demanding of the silent earth some answer as to how the man who had taught her to defend herself could be bound up so tightly with the man who had ended her father's life. And she found no answer, only a grief doubled over on itself. Grief for her father and grief, shamefully, for the man she had allowed herself to love and now could not. Word came to her 3 days later, through Otis Bramwell, that Silas Corwin had grown impatient with the holdouts along Leland Creek and had begun sending riders to burn hay stores and cut fences on 2 of the smaller homesteads to the south. Bramwell rode out to warn her personally, his face grim beneath his hat brim. "You are the last big parcel between his range and the creek, Miss Leland. I would not put it past him to come for you next, and soon." Hazel spent that night cleaning the colt Albert had given her with hands that would not quite stop shaking, checking and rechecking the loads, and she slept, when she slept at all, with the pistol on the table beside her bed. The attack came 4 nights later, in the deep black hours before dawn, when Hazel woke to the smell of smoke and the terrible orange light flickering against her bedroom window. She scrambled from bed and out onto the porch to find her hay barn already engulfed, flames roaring 20 feet into the winter sky, and 3 riders circling her house with torches raised, whooping like men enjoying a party rather than committing arson against a woman alone. "Last chance to sell, Miss Leland," one of them called, a voice she did not recognize, "or the house comes next." Hazel's hands found the colt at her hip, and though her heart hammered fit to break her ribs, she remembered every lesson Albert had ever given her, remembered to breathe, to plant her feet, to sight down the barrel rather than simply pointing and hoping, and she fired a warning shot into the dirt in front of the nearest rider's horse, close enough to make the animal rear and scream. "Get off my land," she shouted, and was startled by the steadiness of her own voice. The riders laughed, and one of them swung his torch toward the porch, and Hazel understood with sudden, sick clarity that she was one woman against 3 armed men, and that her warning shots would not hold them off for long. It was then that a 4th horse came thundering up the road, and a voice she knew better than her own heartbeat rang out across the yard. "Get away from her!" Albert Townsend rode into the firelight with a rifle already raised, and though Hazel's chest was a tangle of fury and betrayal, and something else she could not yet name, she felt a fierce, undeniable relief flood through her at the sight of him. What followed happened fast, the way violence in that country always seemed to happen, too fast for fear to fully take hold before it was over. Albert fired a shot that took the torch clean out of one rider's hand, and in the confusion that followed, Hazel fired again, striking a second man's horse in a place that made it buck and throw its rider into the dirt without serious harm, exactly as Albert had once taught her a shot might be placed to disable without killing. The 3rd rider, seeing his companion scattered and unhorsed, wheeled and fled into the darkness, and within a minute the yard held only Hazel, Albert, 2 groaning men in the dirt, and the roaring collapse of the burning barn behind them. Hazel kept the pistol trained on the fallen men while Albert dismounted and secured their hands with rope from his saddle, and only once the danger had passed did she allow herself to turn to him, her whole body trembling now that the adrenaline had begun to ebb. "Why did you come?" she asked, her voice raw. "Because I love you," Albert said simply, "and because I could not let you face Corwin's men alone, whatever you think of me, whatever I deserve for my silence. Hazel, I need you to hear the truth now, all of it, because you deserve that much even if you never forgive me." She said nothing, only watched him in the dying firelight, and he told her. "I rode for Corwin's outfit for 3 years, Albert said, doing work I am not proud of, but work that never before that night crossed into killing an innocent man. Corwin sent 4 of us out to your father's place that October, meaning to frighten him, to burn a fence line and put fear into him so he would finally sell the water rights. Your father came out with a pitchfork, ready to defend his barn, and one of the men with us, a man named Dale Kerrigan, panicked and drew on him. I grabbed Kerrigan's arm, Hazel, I swear it before God. I tried to stop him, but the shot went wide of where I pulled his aim and it struck your father anyway. He was dead before he hit the ground. I did not fire that shot, but I was there. I rode with the men who did it, and I have carried that weight every single day since. Why did you not go to the sheriff? Hazel demanded, though even as she said it she understood something of the answer, understood the fear a man like Corwin could instill in those who worked for him. Because Corwin owns half the law in 3 counties, and Kerrigan disappeared within a week, sent off to Corwin's ranch in Montana Territory where no sheriff in Wyoming could touch him. I quit the outfit that same week, Hazel. I could not stomach another day of it. I came to Larkspur Crossing meaning only to put distance between myself and what happened. And then Sheriff Bramwell told me a young woman needed shooting lessons. And when I learned your name, when I understood who you were, I told myself I could not do it, could not stand near the daughter of the man I helped kill even by my silence. But then I saw you, Hazel, so determined, so alone, and I thought perhaps this was my chance to do one right thing in a life gone badly wrong, to protect you the way I could not protect your father. I never meant to fall in love with you. I only meant to keep you safe. But I did fall, hopelessly, and every day I did not tell you the truth was a day I hated myself a little more for the lie. Hazel stood in the smoke and the fading firelight, looking at this man who had taught her to hold a pistol steady, who had danced with her at the Christmas social with such careful tenderness, who had just ridden into gunfire to save her life, and she felt her fury war with something gentler, something that understood the terrible weight of guilt and the desperate, flawed ways a person might try to atone for it. I need time, she said finally. I cannot simply forgive this because you rode in tonight and shot a torch from a man's hand. My father is still dead, Albert. I know it, he said, and his voice cracked on the words. I know it, and I do not ask forgiveness. I only ask that you let me help you see this through, help you bring Corwin to justice for what he ordered done, and after that, if you never wish to see me again, I will ride out of this territory and you need never think of me more. Hazel looked at the 2 bound men groaning in her yard, looked at the smoking ruin of her barn, and made a decision that felt less like forgiveness and more like necessity. Help me get justice for my father, she said. That is all I ask of you tonight. What comes after I cannot promise. Sheriff Bramwell arrived at first light to take the 2 captured men into custody, and under the threat of a long sentence for arson and attempted murder. One of them, a nervous young hired hand named P.D. Wills, who could not have been more than 19 years old, agreed to testify that Silas Corwin had personally ordered the attack on Hazel's homestead, and that Corwin had likewise ordered the intimidation raid 3 years before that had resulted in the death of Jacob Leland. Though he swore Corwin himself had not been present at either event. It was not by itself enough to hang a man as wealthy and well-connected as Silas Corwin, but it was enough for a federal marshal to be summoned from Cheyenne, a stern, patient man named Marshal Reeves, who spent a week gathering testimony from half a dozen small ranchers Corwin had bullied over the years, weaving together a case that finally, after so many years of impunity, threatened to hold. Albert Townsend gave his own testimony freely, holding nothing back, admitting his part in the events of that terrible October night, even knowing it might see him charged as an accessory. It was a risk he took without hesitation, and Hazel, watching him stand before Marshal Reeves and speak the truth plainly without excuse, felt something in her stubborn, grieving heart begin, however reluctantly, to soften. You did not have to confess your part, she told him afterward, as they stood outside the small territorial courthouse in the thin winter sunlight. I did, Albert said. I have spent 3 years running from what happened at outfits like Corwin's, Hazel, taking work that let me look away from the harm being done around me. I will not run from this. Whatever the marshal decides for me, I would rather face it honestly than spend one more day carrying a lie. Marshal Reeves, weighing the fact that Albert had actively tried to stop the fatal shot, had quit Corwin's employ immediately after, and had since risked his life to defend the very family he had wronged, ultimately declined to charge him with any crime beyond a formal reprimand for his years of silence, ruling that justice was better served by his continued testimony against Corwin than by his imprisonment. Silas Corwin himself was arrested within the month, his ranch hands scattering to other outfits once it became clear the Double C's fortunes had turned. And though the wheels of territorial justice ground slowly, by the following spring Corwin stood convicted of conspiracy in the death of Jacob Leland and sentenced to many years in the territorial prison at Laramie. It was not a hanging, and some small, bitter part of Hazel wished it had been. But Sheriff Bramwell reminded her gently that even imperfect justice was more than her father's murder had seemed likely to receive only months before, and in time she came to accept that the truth, laid bare at last, mattered more than the particular shape of the punishment. Through all of it, Albert remained near, though he kept a careful, respectful distance, never presuming on the tenderness that had once grown between them, never asking for more than she offered. He helped her rebuild the burned barn through the cold months of early winter, working alongside the Callaway boys and Old Man Hutchins, and Hazel found herself watching him from the porch some evenings, hammer in hand, sweat on his brow despite the cold, and feeling the old warmth stir stubbornly beneath the wound his silence had left. It was a night in late February, with the barn nearly finished and the first hint of a thaw softening the hard-packed snow, that Hazel finally sought him out where he had taken to boarding in the small lined shack at the edge of her property, helping through the worst of winter before he intended, as he had promised, to ride on and leave her in peace. She found him sitting on the shack's narrow step, mending a bridle by lantern light, and he rose quickly when he saw her approaching through the dusk, his face carrying the same wary hope it always did now, the hope of a man who has learned not to expect forgiveness but cannot quite stop himself from wanting it. "I have been thinking," Hazel said, standing before him with her hands twisting nervously at her shawl, "about everything that happened and everything you told me and everything you have done since." "Hazel, you do not owe me any explanation. I told you I would leave when the work here was done, and I meant it." "I do not want you to leave," she said, and the words came out in a rush before her courage could fail her. "I have tried, Albert, to hate you as much as I believe you deserve for the silence, and I cannot manage it, not when I remember every patient hour you spent teaching me, not when I remember you riding into gunfire to save my life, not when I watched you stand before that marshal and tell the truth even knowing it might cost you everything. My father is gone, and no amount of loving or hating you will bring him back. But I do not think he would want me to spend the rest of my life alone on this ranch, punishing myself for loving a man who has spent every day since trying to make amends for a wrong that was never entirely his to begin with." Albert set down the bridle with hands that trembled slightly and stepped closer to her in the lantern light. "Hazel, I do not deserve you. I have known that since the night I first understood you were Jacob Leland's daughter, and I have known it every day since." "Perhaps deserving has little to do with it," Hazel said, and found herself smiling for what felt like the first time in months, a small, fragile thing but real. "Perhaps what matters is what a person does with the chance they are given, and you have not wasted yours, Albert Townsend. You saved my life. You told the truth when it would have been easier by far to keep silent. You have stayed through a hard winter to rebuild what was burned, expecting nothing in return. I think, if I am honest with myself, I never stopped loving you, not even the night I rode away from you at that burned barn with my heart breaking in two directions at once." Albert reached up slowly, giving her every chance to step back if she wished it, and cupped her face gently in his weathered hand, and this time when he leaned down, He did not aim for her cheek. The kiss was soft at first, hesitant, as though he still could not quite believe he was allowed it, and then Hazel's arms came up around his neck, and the hesitation dissolved into something deeper, something that carried in it all the grief and fear and stubborn hope of the months since her father's death. And when they finally parted, both of them were breathless in the cold February air, and both of them were smiling. "I meant what I said that night in the yard," Albert murmured against her hair. "I love you, Hazel Leland. I have loved you since long before I had any right to." "I love you too," Hazel said, and saying it aloud felt like setting down a weight she had been carrying without realizing how heavy it had grown. "Though I suspect my father would have had a great deal to say about a daughter who fell in love with the man who taught her to shoot. I suspect he would have shot me himself first and asked questions after," Albert said dryly, and Hazel laughed, a real laugh, bright and clear in the cold night, the first true laughter she had allowed herself since the barn had burned with her father inside it. They were married that April, in the same small clapboard church where Jacob Leland had been laid to rest, with the widow Hutchins bringing another ham and half the town of Larkspur Crossing turning out to see the ceremony, for word of Corwin's conviction and the strange, hard-won romance between Hazel Leland and Albert Townsend had traveled through the valley all winter, and there was hardly a soul in 3 counties who did not have an opinion on the matter, most of them, by the wedding day, kindly disposed. Sheriff Bramwell gave Hazel away, since she had no father left to do it, and he did so with unashamed tears standing in his eyes, telling anyone who would listen that he had never in all his years as sheriff seen justice and love arrive so entangled with one another, nor seen a young woman face down tragedy with such fierce, unbending courage. Albert, standing at the altar in a new coat purchased with the last of his savings, watched Hazel walk toward him in her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered by the widow Hutchins's careful hands, and he found that his own eyes were not entirely dry either, though he would have denied it to anyone who asked. "You look every bit as steady as the day you first fired that Colt and hit nothing at all," he whispered to her as she reached his side, and Hazel swatted his arm even as she laughed, and the preacher had to wait a moment for the small congregation's answering laughter to settle before he could begin. They built their life together on the Leland homestead in the years that followed, and it was not always an easy life, for the Wyoming winters remained harsh, and the cattle market rose and fell with a fickleness that tested even the most patient rancher. But it was a life built on a foundation more honest than most, for Albert had learned, in the hardest way a man can learn such a thing, that love without truth was no love at all. And he never again allowed a secret to stand unspoken between himself and his wife. Their first child, a son they named Jacob after Hazel's father, was born in the autumn of 1879, arriving with a healthy, furious cry in the same farmhouse where his grandfather had once taught Hazel to ride a horse before she could properly walk. Albert held his son that first night with a tenderness that surprised even Hazel, who had come to know a great deal about the gentle depths hidden beneath her husband's quiet, weathered exterior, and he wept openly, unashamed, whispering promises to the infant about the kind of honest, careful life he intended to build for him. 2 years later came a daughter, whom they named Rose after Hazel's mother, and then, in 1884, another son, a sturdy, laughing boy they named Otis, in honor of the sheriff who had stood by Hazel through the darkest months of her life, and who had by then become something very much like a beloved uncle to the growing Townsend family. Silas Corwin served 11 years of his sentence at the territorial prison in Laramie before dying there of a fever, and Hazel, upon hearing the news carried to her by a passing rider, found that she felt neither triumph nor sorrow, only a quiet sense that the long, painful chapter of her father's death had finally, truly closed. She rode out that same afternoon to her father's grave, now grown old and settled beneath a spreading cottonwood tree that Albert had planted the very spring of their wedding, and she told Jacob Leland, as she often did in quiet moments, about the grandchildren he had never met, about the barn that stood strong and sound where the old one had burned, about the man who had once taught her to shoot and had stayed, through every hardship, to love her instead. Albert Townsend never rode for another cattle outfit again after that winter, choosing instead to build up the Leland homestead alongside his wife, expanding their small herd year by year with honest, patient work. And in time, Larkspur Crossing came to know him not as the drifter with a shadowed past, but simply as Albert Townsend, husband to Hazel, father to Jacob and Rose and Otis, a man whose steady hand and quiet counsel were sought after by half the ranchers in the valley when trouble arose. For there was no one in 3 counties who understood better than he did the terrible cost of silence, nor the redemptive power of a truth finally, fully told. On summer evenings, when the work was done and the children had been chased off to their beds, Hazel and Albert would sometimes walk out together to the fence line behind the rebuilt barn, the very spot where their first shooting lessons had taken place so many years before, and Albert would tease her gently about how poorly she had shot that very first morning, and Hazel would remind him, laughing, that she had gone on to disable a grown man's horse with a single well-placed shot on the night. Their whole future together had nearly been burned to ash. "You saved my life that night," she told him once, on the 10th anniversary of that terrible, transformative winter, as they stood together watching the sun sink gold and red behind the ridge where her father's killers had once vanished into rock and shadow. "You saved mine first," Albert answered, drawing her close against his side. "I was a man running from myself when I came to this town, Hazel. You gave me something worth staying for." She tilted her face up to his. This woman who had once knelt bloodied and broken in a barn doorway, and sworn she would not be easy to kill, who had learned to hold a pistol steady in hands that trembled with grief and fear, who had loved fiercely and been betrayed and forgiven and loved again, deeper and truer for having walked through the fire of it all, and she found in his gray eyes the same steady warmth that had first caught her attention on a cold morning above the livery stable, all those years before. "Then I suppose," she said softly, "we saved each other." And there, beneath the wide Wyoming sky that had witnessed both the worst and the best of what their lives together had held, Albert Townsend kissed his wife with all the tenderness of a man who had learned, at great cost, exactly how precious a second chance truly was, while their children's laughter drifted faintly from the farmhouse behind them, and the rebuilt barn stood solid and sure against the darkening horizon, a testament to everything they had lost, and everything. Against every hard odds of that unforgiving country, they had managed together to rebuild.